Greetings! I'm Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to build this 35th scale Wasp Flamethrower Jeep from Meng. A completely sensible vehicle with which I can see no drawbacks at all. I did make a what's in the box video for this kit, so if you want to see the sprues and such, there's a link somewhere around here. Almost certainly in the description. Go watch that video, and then come back here. We'll wait. Okay, are they gone? I'm going to start gluing bits of plastic together without waiting. Ha 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 ha! I start by building the engine. It's not overly difficult to get all the engine bits together, but there are quite a few individual parts here. Some of these parts will need a little bit of pressure, but most of it just drops together nice and easy. It's a good looking engine, nicely detailed, and it seems to be called a Go Devil, which I'm amused by, but it is also going to barely be visible, unless you're modelling your Wasp tipped over, doing a jump, or if you feel like doing a lot of plastic surgery, with its bonnet open. So while I have built the engine, it would be completely understandable if you chose to omit it in order to save some time. Next, it's time to work on the frame. The first thing to do is remove these doodads from the rear bumper. It does take a little bit of work to remove them and then clean up the mess left behind, but sometimes that's just part of building a model. Sometimes you've got to get messy. Once that's done, I install this piece of bracing like so. This will hold the engine. The engine pretty much plops right into place, but it's probably a good idea to let that piece of bracing we just installed bond for a bit. Just a suggestion. Here's the engine installed on the frame. It's almost a pity we'll be surrounding it with engine bay and such. Running gear is next, and this is the rear axle, onto which I'm gluing half the differential box. The first part already being moulded into the axle, obviously. Onto that, I attach the leaf spring and shock absorber parts. You wouldn't call it keying, but the parts are shaped such that you can tell when they're together properly. You will probably have to do a bit of nudging. This drive shaft goes here, and that completes the rear axle and suspension. The forward one is pretty similar. Again, the first step is gluing half the differential on. One of the main differences here is that the wheels have to steer, so there's a two-part jointy thing on the end of the axle. They're not hard to put on, though you do have to pay attention that you've got the correct parts on the correct side, which is not at all unusual. As you can probably see, these have got an angle to them, and I think I've got them around the right way. That's followed with leaf springs and shock absorbers, pretty much the same as the rear. There's also a steering rod part, but I found it easier to let the previous steps bond before installing that. In the meantime, I add the rear axle assembly to the frame. You might have to do a little bit of nudging just to be sure every contact point, well, contacts. Then the steering rod goes on the front axle. It is a little bit fiddly, but nothing a little gentle nudging can't handle. Why not then install that on the frame? A little nudging may be needed, but it goes into place nicely. I forgot to video myself installing the drive shaft here, but I'm sure you can imagine what that might look like. On the underside of the frame I add this shieldy thing. Believe it or not, I've no idea what the proper name for this is. The muffler is also moulded into this part, which helps get that nice and neat. Now it's time to drill a whole bunch of holes in the body. You should obviously refer to the instructions for this. I'm sure there are some drilling points you don't need to use for this kit, though there are a lot that you do. The steering column goes into place next, and there's a good bit of keying, which makes this very easy to install correctly. In the rear part of the body, there's a couple of bits of detailing that have to be removed. Here's the cabin front wall, or firewall, whatever it's called. There's a few parts that the instructions want you to put on here, one of them being a horn, or something that looks like a horn. These will all be under the bonnet, and as such won't be visible. If I was paying enough attention at the time, I would have omitted these parts. Though it's not like installing them was any kind of a problem. Now for some more detail removal. This time on the tailgate, where some lights and other nubbins need to be cut off. A lot of this will mostly be covered too, but I cleaned it up pretty good anyway. Installing the tailgate is a logical next step, and because I'm so logical, that's what I did. To the left of the steering column, I add what I think is a fire extinguisher. Seems like something you might want on a vehicle like this. The steering shaft does make this a tiny bit more fiddly to add, so you might think about installing it first. Why not follow that with the fuel tank? This is easy to install right here below where the driver's seat will go. Gear sticks go into place next, and there's nothing tricky about these. If you put them in the appropriate holes, everything will be just fine. Next, I glue the back of the radiator into the front of the radiator. This is another one of those parts you probably won't see, and it probably wouldn't matter if you omitted it. At least the inner part anyway. But it's not like it's going to hurt anything to have it in place either. I install that into place behind the front grille, right where you would expect the radiator to go. As you can probably see, you can't see the inner part. You can also see that I haven't installed the headlamp lenses. I've left them out to avoid painting over them. Then, why not glue the body to the frame? You may have to kajigger around the engine a bit, but it more or less drops right into place. I think now is a really good time for wheels. These are easy to put together, the guide pins make sure of it. The front and rear wheels are a little bit different, so it's probably a really good idea not to mix them up. Then, the wheels can be installed. As you might expect, they go on the axles. The fit does have a little bit of play to it, so you'll have to do a bit of eyeballing, but it's simple enough. Next, I glue the dashboard into the, non-lifting part of the bonnet. Yeah, that's what I'll call it. This did need a bit of pressure to get it to fit with no gaps. It can then be installed here. Again, it needed a little bit of pressure-based convincing, but it didn't fight too hard. On either side of the inside of the body, there's a cushiony-looking thing. There is a bit of keying for it, though I had to do a bunch of nudging to get it into the right place. Then, the front bumper goes on with a bare minimum of effort. Just make sure you put it the right way up. There's a couple of tabs that should face upward. Here in the middle of the compartment, there's a square plate with a little round bit on it. This is one of the parts that goes into the drilled holes. Then, to make sure nobody ever sees the engine again, I install the bonnet like so. It seems like you would have to put a lot of work into this if you wanted to model it open to show the engine off, but if you wanted, you could. Doesn't really seem worth the effort to me, personally. Now for some flamethrower related components, like this flamethrower fuel tank. The main barrel part is simple, it's two parts that go together like so. Before putting the end parts on, you have to add the frame bits. The frame parts did need a fair bit of eyeballing to get them straight. I then glue the end parts on, which is about as easy as it looks. Then there's some bracing, which will help you find out if you've got the tank's frame parts out of alignment. I somehow managed to get these on straight first try. Here's a small cylinder for, I don't know, pressurized stuff. This is a nice, simple two-piece assembly. Now for the first part of the most annoying part of the build. After cutting the hose to two appropriate lengths as described by the instructions, I attach them to the bottom of the fuel tank. There's some obvious pins for them. Once the hoses are on, the fuel tank gets glued into the back of the Jeep body, making sure the hoses are positioned how they should be. You might be thinking, boy, that doesn't seem so annoying! But it was a little bit annoying, and I think it would be much better if this was a plastic part. Like I said, it's the most annoying part of the kit, because pretty much everything else is really good. Next, I install that cylinder, which mounts onto the round bit on that square plate we installed earlier, and then this piece of piping with a valve on top. I don't know what its function is, but it's not too hard to slot into the little notch in the fuel tank's bracket and the hole in the floor. Seats are installed next. The driver and flamethrowersman's seats are different, but both are easy to put together. The driver's seat plops into place over the fuel tank as easy as you like. The other one is made a bit more annoying to install by those hoses. It's not the worst thing in the world, you just have to hold the seat down while it bonds, because the hoses want to push it up and out of place. Next, I glue together this whatever it is. It seems both flamethrower and engine related. The end parts here are the weakest part of this assembly, especially the one that will have a pipe attached to it. I'm sure it's mostly user error. The result is just a little bit more gappy than I really want it to be. It can then be installed into the mounting holes here, right in front of the driver, who I'm sure really doesn't mind having his forward visibility being obstructed. This piece of piping then gets glued together like so. The angled shape of the contact points makes it easier to be sure you've got it all lined up properly. Then, this pipe with a valve of some sort moulded into it is sandwiched between these two parts to make a thing.
Oh, very descriptive, Herbert.
Into this I glue that pipe I just put together before. There's a D-shaped keying here, which will probably stop you from installing this at some weird, incorrect angle. That whole assembly can then be installed, connecting the cylinder at the front and a protrusion at the rear behind the big fuel tank. It should pass between the two valves in the middle. It took a bit of fiddling and nudging, and was very moderately annoying to put into place, but it does go into place. Then, why not install this box here? This is probably for snacks, or maybe burn treatment kits or something like that. No, it's probably snacks. On the bottom of the rear bumper, I add this thing. I suspect it might be some kind of connection for a fuel trailer. The tow hitch goes into place above that, which is very simple. Then on the left side of the rear bumper, this light goes on. This replaces the one on the tailgate that was chopped off. There's another stowage box, and this one needs to have the two ends attached, which again is pretty simple. Then it goes into place on the front right mudguard. You can see the box doesn't actually have a bottom, but that's probably not too much of an issue. The steering wheel comes next. There's not a whole lot to say about this, just try to get it nice and straight, which I kind of failed at. Jerry can assembly is next, and this is, you guessed it, simple. There is a couple of different kinds, with slightly different parts involved, but they're all more or less the same, so you probably don't need to watch me assembling every different type. And if you do, too bad, I guess. I didn't video them all. To go with the different jerry can assemblies, there's also different jerry can installations. The two in the front have slots in the bottom which interact with the tabs on the bumper. They go on pretty easily, though you will have to apply a little bit of pressure. There's one like this in different positions on either side. The guide holes make these easy to place. And then, instead of a jerry can on the driver's side here, we get a little handle, presumably so the driver can hang onto it while doing sick tricks. Spare wheel assembly is next, which is very similar to the regular wheels, just the parts are a bit different, and we glue them both side by side rather than onto the axles. I set them aside to bond while I put together this chair-looking piece of doodadery. It's not a chair, it's the mounting for the flamethrower. It is a little bit fiddly to get these parts all lined up nice and straight. It made sense to then install that on the front here, like so. It really does look like a seat for an especially daring crew member, but it isn't. On the rear bumper, I install this double tyre doodad. There's a little guide notch for it, so it's pretty easy to place. The spare tyres should also be easy to place, but for me, the guide pins were slightly out of place. The solution was to just cut one off, and then the spare wheel's easy to place. I glue them to the doodad so it looks like they're resting on it. Assembling the flamethrower is next, and it's not especially complicated. It is probably a pretty good idea to make sure you've got all the bits aligned properly. It would be kind of silly to have that big chonk on the end of the flamethrower upside down. The handles on the rear of the assembly are easy enough to place, but they don't look like they would be hard to break. It might increase fiddliness, but you could omit these until the flamethrower is in place. Just a thought, it's probably not really worth that kind of effort. Now to install the flamethrower. The first thing is connecting these rubbery hoses, which is kind of fiddly and annoying. Again, because this is not plastic, we need to use superglue, and you might consider using an accelerator here. I did, but it was still pretty annoying. It would probably be less of an annoyance if there was just one hose, but there's two, and having two of them means they encourage each other to misbehave. Once you are confident the hoses are going to stay where you want them, it's a pretty simple matter of putting the flamethrower into its mount, on the chair-looking thing. You will probably have to hold it down for a bit because the hoses don't want it to stay there. I then add another jerry can that I didn't feel like assembling earlier on the front right, and a set of 4 to the rear, and other than the headlamps, which, as I mentioned earlier, will be left off until painting due to their clearness, that's the Meng Wasp flamethrower Jeep in 35th scale, completed, and I think it's a really cool model. The real thing is an interesting, if terrible idea, which is right up my alley. Old Herbert loves terrible ideas, as well as odd, unusual subjects for models. I also rather like models that go together without too much fighting and resistance, and this is certainly one of those. Well, mostly. The rubber hose being the main problem in this regard. I'm starting to expect this kind of good quality from Meng kits. I've not built a lot of them, but so far, I've enjoyed every one of them that I have built. The parts are neat and crisp, and while there is obviously some cleanup required, it wasn't a big deal, and there were no problems or errors with the mold. There may be some inaccuracies in the detailing, but not being a waspologist, I wouldn't be able to point them out. It looks pretty accurate to me. This wasn't the quickest kit to put together. There are quite a few parts, and that's obviously not a bad thing, and I would certainly recommend the kit, though maybe not to a brand new modeler. That said, I wouldn't say it's too big an undertaking for your average modeler, especially since the parts are so neatly made that pretty much everything fits together without issue, and very little correction or gap filling will be required. So a hearty thumbs up from me. If you want a flamethrower Jeep, this would be a good choice. If you've got any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the comment section below. If you'd like to watch me build kits like this one live, I stream modelling a couple of times a week over on Twitch. There's a link in the description. Subscribe if you want to see more of this kind of thing. Share the video with anybody you think might find it helpful, and if you really like what I do, consider supporting on Patreon or Ko-fi. Take care of yourselves, be excellent to each other, and thanks for watching. Farewell.